This is the last of the 6 Capitals of Music series for this academic year, and following the normal quote, we end up where all roads end up, in Rome. The date is New Year's Day 1700, the beginning of a new century, when Corelli very cleverly planned and published his only set of violins, solo violin sonatas, opus 5. They were the beginning of a new century of music, he thought, and they were enormously important throughout that century. Everybody had waited for them because they'd known that they circulated, they'd heard Corelli playing them prior to this date, so the world was rather agog. And they became then, for the whole century, more or less, the model of how to write for the violin. Charles Burney, the music historian that we're always quoting, said, Corelli's solos as a classic book for forming the hand of a young practitioner on the violin has ever been regarded as a most useful and valuable work by the greatest masters of that instrument. He was always a bit pompous about his descriptions, and that's definitely a sort of global stance. Roger North was the other English music historian who is a little more down to earth, and I rather like him. He reported that when Corelli's music arrived in England, it became, for musicians, like the bread of life. And then 10 years later, after the sonatas had circulated well, he was able to be enthusiastic and to say, it's wonderful to observe what a scratching of Corelli there is everywhere now. Nothing will relish but Corelli. So I suppose in modern terms, Corelli went viral. The result was they were reprinted, of course, this particular set of sonatas many, many times during the 18th century. So there were some 36 reissues and 20 issues of adapted and arranged versions. So these were the most known sonatas in the world at that time. Many of the arrangements were for the convenience of flute players or gamba players and so on. Some of them were for the benefit of larger groups who thought it would be rather nice to play solo sonatas adapted for a full team. And since we have a full team today, I thought that would be the starting point for us hearing the grandest version of a Corelli sonata that you could find. So we'll explore these sonatas in their various forms today, because they're still, I think, the works that most student violinists find themselves obliged to play. Is this true? Yes, you nearly all have a copy of 12 Corelli sonatas sitting somewhere with your teacher's fingering and a few ideas of this, that, and the other. The problem is the repertoire has survived, but the performing traditions that lay behind it have not survived. And that's really what I would like to touch on this afternoon. There are 2 slightly broader topics that I think you can also consider while this is going on. One is the question that several people have asked me earlier in this academic year. Frankly, what does a musicologist do and why? I hope, since what we're using for these performances are editions that we've been working on for the last year or so, I hope by the end of this hour you'll be able to see what it is I happen to like doing as a musicologist and the point of doing it. The other question that you could well ponder while the music is going on is this question that philosophers love to place in front of you, asking, when you describe a piece of music, you know, a Corelli sonata, is it an object, an artifact, something you take off the shelf and look at and point at and say, this is physically Corelli's sonata, or Beethoven's symphony, or Bruckner, or Wagner's opera, or whatever? Does the music consist of an object, or is it an activity? Does it only happen when it's played, when you hear it, when somebody else is revitalizing it and recreating it? Is it object or activity? We'll come back to that later on when you've heard some of the evidence of what Corelli expected from his performance. Meanwhile, here is the opening salvo in the Corelli program for this afternoon. It's an arrangement of a sonata we'll look at in more detail after the orchestra has played this adaptation of Sonata 5 by Corelli, originally for solo violin and continuo, expanded, elaborated on, and developed for the benefit of more enthusiasts by his prize pupil, Francesco Geminiani. mixed feelings in the 18th century about this set of arrangements that Geminiani made. I hope you like them. I like them, especially the pizzicato idea at the end. But Burney, who we've already quoted, was not so impressed by all this. Burney says that Geminiani transformed Corelli's solos into concertos by multiplying notes and loading and deforming, I think, those melodies that were more graceful and pleasing in their light original dress. I don't particularly feel anything was deformed there, but you can draw your own conclusions after you've heard what they were derived from. Here's a slightly more enthusiastic recognition of them by a Cambridge Don in the 1760s. He says, "Masters of music by practice have lately," that is by the mid-century, "found out a better, easier and stronger way of performing upon their several instruments than was formerly known. And to this new and better method of performance they have composed suitable music, which admits of greater execution, greater variety of expression, and a better tone than could be brought out of instruments before such improvements were made." He was definitely seeing the world as a constantly improving artistic space. And he goes on to say, "And we find that Geminiani, who was a close follower of Corelli, has thought proper to make concertos of what Corelli intended for solos, well knowing that though the ground of them was exceeding fine, yet they were very capable of being improved by adding parts to them, and adorning them with what might be called, at that time, modern embellishments and graces." Well, he hits on a topic which is actually more important than he probably realized, that what Geminiani was doing when he expanded the concertos by adding parts and sometimes by allocating the original solo line to different people and giving interesting pizzicato accompaniments and all the rest. The Geminiani was also well aware that Corelli himself would never have expected people to play his music without embellishments and graces. This was part of the performing tradition. It was improvised, and one of the things that made Italian musicians so impressive and popular outside Italy was that they brought with them the techniques for standing in front of a very simple piece of music and delivering cascades of notes that were absolutely amazing, and nobody knew where they came from, and they were never the same twice. This was completely free embellishment. Corelli himself was very famous for delivering in this style, and people were very anxious to know how you did it, what the notes actually were, how you could learn this skill. It's still, on the whole, a missing technique today, which is what I meant by saying that although the repertoire has survived, on the whole, in most music schools, the performance tradition of being able to do this thing extempore is no longer very much practiced. So I thought it'd be quite nice for us to hear some of the evidence to show how a very straightforward Corelli line, as written, as printed, might have been developed by himself or by his followers, and certainly how it was embellished and then notated by the English who tried to follow in this tradition. So we have some little samples. They're from what you've just heard, so this is now the original format of the sonata as Corelli wrote it, with a solo violin and a continuo group, which Corelli described as being for cello or harpsichord. Sometimes it's assumed to be and. We'll show you the various permutations later. Let me just move these a little bit away so we can actually see you. And we begin with the absolutely plain version, just the beginning of the sonata that you heard in concerto form, as Corelli's printed edition, New Year's Day 1700, would have shown it. That was how Corelli never thought you would hear it. It's unfortunately how you normally hear it 99 times out of 100 nowadays, played very beautifully, very straight, very plain. Corelli would have expected some attempt at embellishing and decorating, and because people realized this was something they needed to be aware of, even the people who published the music published very shortly after its first edition a second edition. This came out from Amsterdam by a publisher called Etienne Roger, and he published above the violin part another stave where he notated extra notes, the embellishments. He said, as Mr. Corelli played them. There was then a little bit of dispute in the press as to whether this was really true, and what were these the notes as Mr. Corelli played them. And Etienne Roger said, yes, of course, I have it in documents, and I have a letter from him and everything else. But it's noticeable that when he reissued them, he slightly tinkered with the wording, and he said, these are the ornaments as Mr. Corelli would have them played. This maybe was a disclaimer, but they're certainly moderate, and this is how that same passage would sound if you played the alternate embellished version that was published. You can sense the original skeleton under the extra embellishments, and I think there's no problem for the accompanist. You just keep going, because you don't know what she's going to do next, because it's, in theory, extemporized. So there's no possible way you could practice and accommodate this. Sometimes it gets a little bit more tricky. There was, at that time, a famous Swedish violinist, Johann Roman, in England. He played in Handel's orchestra, for example. He learnt from Geminiani. He was quite well known as a soloist. He went back to Sweden and was a major composer during his lifetime. And amongst his manuscripts, you have a lot of rather wildly decorated versions of the famous Corelli sonatas. I think some of you will find on your seats, maybe you're sitting on them, or maybe you have them in your hands, the sheet of facsimiles showing how we know what these ornaments are. So if you see those, the first one is what you have just heard, the superimposed writing that Roger published. The line under that, Mr. Roman's varied repeat, you can see immediately, just from the handwriting and the wild number of notes flying around, is nowhere in the same category as Roger. And you have to be quite clever at accommodating what he shows with these little notes into the metrical pattern. This is what he was expecting you to play. Become a much more luxurious sort of piece now. It's interesting, among the various samples that you see here, there are certain similarities which I think can be put down to the fact that many of these people possibly heard Corelli play, although to do that you would have had to go to Rome, and he didn't travel, so you had to go and hear him in person. But more likely because they were all familiar with and had probably been taught by pupils of Corelli, so Veracini, or certainly in London, Geminiani. And so you begin to see with people that are coming up on the list, like Michael Christian Festing, for example, who worked as the music director in Dublin for a lot of who worked as the music director for the Vauxhall Gardens in London and London theatres for much of his life, and also Matthew Dubourg, who was the music director in Dublin and led the orchestra when Handel first performed Messiah there. These violinists had all been tutored by Geminiani, and therefore amongst their suggested decorations, you can see, I think, little similarities of shifting and little melodic things, but they all have their own character. Here's Michael Christian Festing, for instance. Here for comparison is Matthew Dubourg, who, as I say, worked for Handel. In fact, Dubourg was famous for taking enormous liberties with the music that he performed and indulging in extended cadenzas, because Handel himself was once the victim of this. Dubourg went off in an oratorio with a long cadenza and was just coming back to the concluding trill when he realized he was in the wrong key, and he had to start off again and go round in circles in order to come back to the correct tonality for everybody to join in. And when he did, Handel stood up and said, "Welcome home, Mr. Dubourg." It sounds extraordinarily complicated, but in fact, if you remember that these pieces were treated by the public, amateur musicians and professional musicians, as classics, then almost everybody knew them by heart. John Hawkins says that for 40 years they were such classics that people would quote from Corelli sonatas in the way they would quote from Virgil or Homer. It was just a well-known thing. So if it was going to stretch a little bit, then the accompanist would be so familiar with the basic outline. It, of course, is easier if you only have one accompanist, and I think that is perhaps why Corelli said on his title page that the accompaniment was for cello or harpsichord. And, of course, one must remember that a cellist can play extra notes and give an impression of harmony. And a harpsichord certainly played with big fat chords like the Tonelli realization that we have from this same period could be a perfect. You'll hear that in practice maybe in this next one. We'll do half with cello alone and then with harpsichord alone. This sample comes from north of the border. There was a strong Corelli faction in Edinburgh, and two people, Mr. McGibbon and a younger one, Mr. MacLean, put down in their manuscripts their suggestions of how to decorate Corelli. These have only recently come to light, so you're perhaps the first people to hear them actually demonstrated. But I rather like McGibbon, and this is we'll change the specimen thing. So this is a little bit from the second half of this same movement. First of all, played plain and with cello, showing that it can do a full job of accompaniment, and then going into McGibbon's decorated version with harpsichord, showing it can be self-sufficient as well. that presents the good, what I would call the good face of embellishments and notated embellishments. There's always going to be, of course, a temptation when you're writing something down to write down the ultimate version you could think possible, just to show, to boast, basically, of what you might one day play in performance. It leads inevitably, I think, to a situation where some of these very traditional classical movements, certainly the more dancing movements, became the basis for sets of studies and variations that are no longer to be seen quite as things you would employ when playing a Corelli sonata, but more a skeleton plan on which you can test ever more difficult finger work and patternings. And that really is what happened, for example, with Tartini, who took one very small Corelli tune and worked it over 1,000,000 times in L'arte dell'arco, giving you all the possible variants in technical styles and musical elaboration, not suitable for inclusion in a performance of a sonata, but very good for extending the technique of a player. The same happens with Cartier, of course, in his violin school, the French equivalent of Tartini, where the variations are stacked up. One poor little tune at the bottom and 50 possible variants above it, asking for more and more technique. Not all of them showing, though, a great deal of musical elegance and sympathy, as we found, for example, in that McGibbon. But try it on this movement, because this is the last movement of the sonata, the one that you heard with the pizzicato accompaniment. It's a jig, and so it's in triple time, compound triple time, and this is its plain version before we hear the various things that McGibbon decided he could do to it. Takes it on and does the thing that a lot of violinists would do in the 18th century, preserves the rhythmic framework, adds a few extra notes, and shows you what clever bow strokes he can add to the construction. But it is still recognizably a danceable jig. Treat it quite differently by killing the aspect of the jig and the dance totally, fitting in rather more notes, that it turns into a movement which is just a variant study, I would say, on a Corelli idea. If you let that sort of idea run riot, you're soon in this territory of really ridiculous variants that you wouldn't, I think, recommend to anybody to employ in a complete sonata, but they show what violinists could do. Two were published in the 18th century, one by Cateni, we have no idea who he is, and one by Valentini, we have no idea which of the many Mr. Valentines in London this might have been. So they're conveniently anonymous for the purposes of this, but you could play them both. The first one certainly shows off bowing tricks, and the Valentini example, I think, is purely to show how many notes per minute you can fit into the piece. But I think it's gone a long way away from Corelli, and it is more in the territory of Tartini and Cartier, exercises and variations on a theme. Put all those sort of samples of decoration while I'm collecting them into a box labeled Beyond Parody. I think they are very great for violinists too. They're good fun to play, but I'm not sure that they are of much musical use for the historical musicologist or the historically informed performer to add to their performance of Corelli. But I think by this stage you'll have seen exactly where the evidence lies for, at least in this repertoire, the music that we're talking about is in fact an activity and not an encapsulated art piece that you can pull down from the shelf. There is, I think, from the musicologist's point of view, never going to be a single perfect final version of a score that you can present. For a long time the world has been ruled by a concept called Urtext, where largely, as you might guess, German invention, of presenting a finished and final version which shows exactly what the composer wanted and the only version you should consider valid for performance. It turns out that in most cases this is not so. Most composers were ambivalent about their work, constantly tinkering with it. Mendelssohn, for example, suffered, he said, from Revisionskrankheit. That is, every time he saw a piece of his own music, he wanted to rewrite it. And there's a process going on of which one should be aware. It teaches people who are budding composers, it teaches performers how to rethink the music that's in front of them. And in cases like Corelli and his contemporaries, in a period that was based a lot on individual improvisation, it gives you an enormous number of samples to show how you might begin to adopt the same standpoint of Corelli's music being an activity, not a printed volume. The end product, of course, of all these examples that we've been playing is that they can become assimilated, and very soon your head should be so full of alternative embellished versions and things that you could transpose into another key for another sonata, and things that you invent yourself, or amalgams and cocktails you can make between all these versions, that you'll soon, I think, have a pretty good repertoire from memory for decorating any new piece of Baroque Italianate music that is put in front of you. That's an ideal, but I think it's one that most courses that deal in historical performance would aim towards. And I think it's the musicologist's job to try and provide such enthusiastic students with as much information and background evidence as is possible. Put it all out on the page, and then it's up to them to sort out what suits their particular style, taste, character, or the mood of the day, and to fit it into the work that they're faced with. But as soon as it becomes second nature and is memorized, then you've got over a major hurdle, and everybody has these sort of things at their fingertips in a literal sense. We should perhaps now just try and reverse this process that we've done, going from the biggest version down to the smaller elements and the added improvisations, by choosing another sonata, which we'll do in its component parts as a sort of teaching sequence, maybe, a sort of sample of how, I don't know how you are taught this, but I suspect it probably begins with everybody playing the simple version of a Corelli movement. So let's hear, this is Sonata 9. We move, you're on the other side of your embellishments for the moment, and this is what is not printed here, the very simple version of the first movement, to get it into your head so that you are in this condition of feeling that this is a well-known classical quotation. That's the sort of thing that leads program note writers to get very enthusiastic about the simplicity and purity of Corelli's style. But in fact, as you now know, that's exactly what Corelli didn't want to hear. So it was not purity and simplicity, although it's a wonderfully constructed skeleton plan. Now you're onto your hymn sheets, and if you want to see the source for this next thing, it's labelled Tartini, which is very obviously the same line with I find very sweet and very nice and not at all demonstrative addition. So I wouldn't call it technically showy in any way, but it is beautifully characterized and personalized, which the first version possibly wasn't. Show off anything other than good melodic sense, and just occasionally something that rises outside the original melodic line to give it a little mountain to climb and then out the other side. Here's another sample, same movement. This is a non. We call it Manchester simply because it lives in Manchester at the moment. So you can find this manuscript in the Henry Watson Music Library, and as you can see from the little sample printed here, it's obviously didactic because it's labelled Adagio, and you see there are two staves. Elsewhere in the manuscript you get three staves where whoever this inventor is stacks up different versions of approaching the same melodic line. So we're going to hear here the top one, but you can see immediately underneath he gives you an alternative with slightly more notes. What is apparent is that he had a terrific enthusiasm for trills, I think. So the personal fingerprint of this particular decorator is, you know, look at my trills. demanding, but I would have thought on the applause meter it wouldn't score half as much as Tartini. So it's clear that you can do various things in embellishing sonatas, which are not always to a great musical point. And I would, if I was sort of demonstrating to people possible ways of approaching ornamenting, my tendency would be towards offering them Manchester A, B and C as being samples of probably how not to do it. But you might find that within that version you can prune something, you can take some of the ideas, perhaps you can weld a few onto Tartini if you thought he wasn't showy enough or didn't have enough truth, and so make your own amalgam. So it's certainly not wasted, but I would certainly not give it the fullest marks. Here's a sample of another tricky moment in all embellishing. This is at the end of a movement, because, for obvious reasons, cadenzas are associated with cadences. It's the same word. And it's because when you are approaching a full close, it's very obvious to the accompanists that you're getting there. And if you choose to linger at that moment, well, it's understandable. If you were to do it at the beginning of a movement or in mid-phrase, it might be a little bit upsetting and we wouldn't know you were going. But when it's on the dominant, which is clearly going to resolve to the tonic any minute and everything will come to a halt, then you have an ad libitum moment to get busy. This again is a mystery person. It lives in Cambridge, but we don't know who it was. But it was certainly who aimed to get as many words into the last line of the limerick as he possibly could, sort of thing. Here's the plain version, the cadence of this movement, followed by what Mr. Cambridge decided it was possible to cram in to show your technique at the very last moment. That version not bad, but a little extreme in what it imposes on the music. So, but if you have it in your head and it's something that you can feel out as though you just invented it, it does sound very impressive. Finally, and as a bridge back to a complete concerto version of this sonata that you've been hearing, here's the only sample of a Corelli sonata we have, decorated by Geminiani. Geminiani was, as I said, Corelli's prize pupil. He came to England and didn't win that many friends because, amongst other things, he refused to give public concerts. And they thought this was not a done thing for an Italian violinist. He then told the public that he took greater pleasure in dealing in art and collecting paintings than he did in playing music. And then he published his own music, which people decided was very special, very quirky, but not really what they expected of a highly paid violin virtuoso. And so he slipped in public estimation to be where he is now, a famous name but not very much played. On the other hand, his evidence of what his teacher would have considered, I think, suitable embellishments for all movements of the sonata. He covered the fast movements as well as the slow movements, but this is the opening slow movement, complete with Geminiani's embellishments. Luckily, they were printed. A copy got around, and Sir John Hawkins happened to have it, and then published it in his Complete History of Music. Otherwise, we would have lost these. But I think it's a very valuable little recording of how Corelli would have delivered, of how Geminiani would have delivered Corelli's sonata. full version of that same sonata as dressed up by Geminiani with full parts. You'll notice that part of his arranging technique involves not embellishing. In these concerto arrangements, you don't have at all this fluttery million notes a minute style. They're very simply done in terms of virtuosity, but the ways of integrating the original line divided amongst many players. Hardly anybody gets away with nothing. There are many virtuosi. Even the violas have very interesting and self-sufficient parts. The bass is very cunningly worked against the cellos and that sort of thing. They are expansions, I think, in an extremely sympathetic and dreaming form. And it does mean, as Geminiani obviously intended, that Corelli's music gets played socially by more and more people. You didn't have to be an expert or even a professional to play in the tutti sections of these concertos, but you could have the social experience of being part of a modern music performance, and that, I think, constitutes the essentials of music being an activity rather than a luxury-bound Urtext edition.